Good afternoon. Today I am bringing you a special about an article I saw on Medium today on Facebook while I was perusing Facebook, and I wanted to discuss this with you. It is by a writer by the name of Umar Haq, and it's entitled "How the American Idiot Made America Unlivable." America's a poor country now, in ways that are likely to be permanent. Now, let me stress when I first say this is that I don't think every single American is an idiot. But there has been in our culture in the last, I would dare say 40 years, of getting away from more upscale, more of a trying to get a higher common denominator amongst people and trying to satisfy the lowest common denominator. And I'm going to read parts of the article, and I'm going to comment as I go along. And I'm going to quote from the article starting right now. New Zealand declared victory over coronavirus yesterday. Team New Zealand, as Kiwis refer to themselves, celebrated having a virus-free country. America, on the other hand, had close to 70,000 cases. 70,000 and exploding. What the American idiot has done to America is to make an impoverished country. Not just any kind of poverty, what you might call deep poverty. Let me explain. Now, before I go on with this article, I'm going to discuss how potent that word American idiot is. And not just the Green Day song either. There is the stereotype overseas of the so-called ugly American, where we go in, we demand people speak English to us, whereas if they come over here, we demand they speak English to us over here, that we tend to be very boisterous, obnoxious, basically trying to have things our way over in their country. But if they come over here, we expect them to automatically understand our customs and all of that. Well, this is part of it. Now, I don't know who this writer is. This is the first time I've ever read anything from him. So I have no idea if he lives in the United States or if he doesn't. But it's a very interesting article, to say the least. And I'll continue now to read on the article. New Zealand has 0 new cases of corona. In America, they're spinning out of control. One way to think about it is to say that your chances of dying of this lethal pandemic are now infinitely higher in America than in New Zealand. Compared to Europe and Canada, they're about 100 times higher. That's the kind of poverty, too. A poverty of public health. Americans have spent decades being impoverished of the public by the American idiot. The kind of person who votes against better health care for everyone, including themselves, their kids, their parents. What kind of idiot does that? A very, very large number of Americans. Now, when I read that, it goes back to this idea that Herbert Hoover, back in the 1920s, amongst other conservatives, brought about rugged individualism. That the American people did not need big government, or any government for that matter, to make it on their own. And while in a sense that's always been part of the American personality, the truth of the matter is it's always been kind of a any kind of socialism kind of deal that even goes against what even some modern day conservatives would now consider to be something perfectly acceptable, like Social Security, like Medicare. This is, back in that time, there was no Social Security, there was no Medicare, there was no real, any kind of government welfare whatsoever on the federal level. There might have been in some state levels, there might have been at particular times government programs to help people out in short periods of time of extreme economic distress. Now, a lot of these programs that you heard of from the New Deal came about during the Great Depression after Herbert Hoover's economic theories and whatnot basically collapsed under the weight of the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt rode into electoral victory in 1932, promising a lot of government spending, a lot of government programs to help boost the economy, and essentially it took a while, but eventually it did succeed. But there were many people who didn't like it for the simple reason that it was, in their mind, creating a government dependency among the citizens, which I've often said is kind of bullocks, because there are a lot of things that people simply can't do on their own that people expect in other countries, and we should expect here. I'm going to continue reading from the article. The result of that attitude was a society poor in a gruesome and strange way, poor in public health itself. What I mean by that is that American life expectancy is the lowest in the rich world and plummeting. That Americans have high rates of all kinds of preventable chronic diseases, from diabetes to obesity to heart disease. You can see it on American faces, in fact. A society poor in health is a society of unhealthy people. We expect much, much poorer societies to be impoverished in public health. It's a strange concept to have to think about, precisely because we don't expect it of a rich country, perhaps of a poor one that's never really been developed at all. I should say that's never really developed at all. This is a syndrome unique to America, a form of poverty that Europeans and Canadians struggle to understand because, well, they've mostly eliminated it. But in America, health poverty is endemic. So endemic that you can see America has gotten shockingly poor in health, right down to the resurgence of old conquered diseases from measles to mumps. Again, that's the word of the American idiot, the work of the American idiot, the kind of person who won't vaccinate their kids, which is an idea that in the end takes society right back to medieval days of endemic smallpox and polio. This goes back to the concept of the so-called rugged individualists. It's spun off over the years, and a lot of this happened after World War II, when we won the big war, and from the 1940s up until the 1960s, the New Deal style of government took hold. It brought about the Eisenhower highway system. It brought about a lot of modernization that made America the greatest country in the world in economic terms and in a lot of other terms. There are a lot of flaws still there, obviously. The civil rights movement started in the 1950s. Blacks started seeing that, hey, whites are living better than us. Why can't we live this better than us? And it started a lot of different social movements. It started women's liberation. It started a push toward more rights for gays and lesbians and whatnot. And that inevitably had a backlash. And that backlash started in the 1960s when the civil rights movement achieved a huge victory, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, this pushed a lot of conservative Southern Democrats away from the traditional Democratic Party and eventually moved them to the Republican Party, and that's why you've got the dichotomy we have today in America. And a lot of that is because they felt like that it's something that goes back to right after the Civil War, where the slaves were freed and these poor blacks were sharecropping, were trying to make a life for themselves. And in some cases they had common cause with poor whites who were just as bad off as they were. And in some areas, they were starting to work together to help each other out. And this was something that scared the rich white elites. This is something you hear about in Wilmington, North Carolina, back in the 1880s, where there was a massacre and killed a lot of black people and basically put blacks, quote-unquote, in their place. This has happened many times over history in big events like the Tulsa Massacre of the 1920s, and in other smaller kind of deals, where it was essentially to basically put blacks, quote, in their place. And that's part of the reason why we still have problems with white supremacy today, and institutional racism, systemic racism, what have you not. It's still there. We should have been done with this a long time ago, but unfortunately, because of the Herbert Hoover-esque kind of thinking that's still around, this so-called rugged individualism, this so-called libertarianism, we're still dealing with it. I'm going to continue reading from the article. So what was going to happen when a society impoverished in terms of health met a pandemic? Utter catastrophe. America's mortality rate and infection rate are so high precisely because America was a time bomb of failing public health waiting to go off. What then are the results of creating society impoverished in public health? Well, Americans face a gruesome choice that doesn't exist anywhere else in the rich world, even in much of the poorer one. Your money or your life. Medical bankruptcy is the result. I put it in quotes because it's a notion that scarcely exists elsewhere. How did it all happen? Americans are culturally impoverished too. The American idiot has turned American culture into one of the world's regressive, short-sighted, narrow-minded, and idiotic. Literally, the tiniest shreds of decency and sanity come under a murderous, withering barrage of denial and false debate, from things as simple as wearing masks to ones as large as educating Americans about how the rest of the rich world, and even the poor ones now, have vastly better functioning societies. And that is true. Part of it is this idea of American exceptionalism, which used to hold water, but doesn't anymore because we have allowed ourselves, through our arrogance and our stupidity, to regress. We felt like we were perfect. We felt like we didn't have to change. We felt like we didn't have to improve ourselves. Other nations saw that they had issues and changed. We haven't really changed a whole lot. Or if we have changed some, there has been backlash and it's sent us back like we've seen in the last few years. And a lot of that is because of this idea of white supremacy, which doesn't really exist anywhere else to the extent it does here. There is still some in Germany and parts of Europe, but that in many cases is also clouded in nationalism, which has been centuries older than this country, and it's more ethnic than anything else. And of course there's the influx of refugees and immigrants from nearby countries that have caused a lot of this, that where some of these societies have had historical grievances against them. I mean, you look at European history, especially if you look at the history of the Crusades and whatnot, yeah, there are people who still remember that stuff. Where here, we really only have to worry about immigration from immigration on the ground from Mexico and Central America and Cuba and other countries, but in the Caribbean and such. But it's one of those situations where, as I continue on with this article, it kind of made me aware of some things that, looking from the outside in, it's a very shocking commentary about our society. I'll continue with the article. Huge chunks of American culture are so hateful, foolish, or bizarre that they're either illegal, laughable, or bewildering in much of the rest of the world, from Canada, Europe, or Asia. Debating whether the answer to school shootings, which happen nowhere else, is to arm teachers, the idea that billionaires are somehow good for society, or that things like health care, retirement, pensions, income, and safety aren't human rights, that money is all that should matter. Nearly everywhere else in the world finds such notions jaw-droppingly foolish by now, which is how the American idiot made his country a laughingstock the world over. Now, that is a very potent term to say American idiot. And I stress that when I see this, it's going to make people go, "Oh my God, he's bashing America." Nope. If you have a problem, if you have a friend who has an addiction, or a family member who has an addiction, you want them to beat their addiction. The addiction we have right now is this idea that we're infallible, that everything we do is perfect, everything is ordained by God, that we are chosen by God to be this great power, when in fact, no, we're not any better than any other nation, because in many cases, a lot of those people to say that have come here from overseas. We're a melting pot. Every nation on this planet has a sizable community of some that could be considered a community, not just a small gaggle of people in this country. Even the smallest country in the world has some people here that you could consider a small community in the United States. I'll continue with the article. The point of a culture of idiocy, of course, is to create idiots, and the American culture is the cradle and mother's milk of the American idiot. From Tucker Carlson to Bill O'Reilly to ancient aliens, an impoverished culture keeps America ignorant, pliable, submissive, and frightened. Tucker will fill your head with misinformation and the reality TV that makes it seem like normal to be an idiot. The result of cultural impoverishment, though, is that Americans, they stay poor in more visible, visceral ways, like poor in health care, inequality, and power and money. I'm going to take a moment to explain something to you. Media companies there used to be 50 media companies, plus even more, across the country back in the 60s and 70s. In the 1980s, they started to coalesce in the era of deregulation by Ronald Reagan and other conservative politicians who wanted to allow mergers of bigger and bigger corporations and less regulation of these. On the surface, it seems like a good idea, but the problem is that let's say you have societies playing a game. In any game, you have to have rules. If you're playing American football, you don't clothesline other guys anymore. You don't hit guys with your forearm anymore like you used to. There's a reason for that. People kept getting injured, in some cases killed because of that. Over the course of time, more rules came into effect to make play safer in football. The same as in society. Over the course of the post-war era, as more people realized the dangers of the workplace as well as the environment and other things like that, more and more regulations came about until the 1980s came along, and Reagan and his folks decided that we had too many regulations. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, and in some cases they were right. But it's gone from streamlining regulations to basically trying to make government weak as well water, as we like to say here in the South. And to me, it's always been about power. In the post-war era, we had a middle class growing. More and more people felt upwardly mobile. They felt like they could have a say in society. They were going to college. They were making careers. The economy was generally booming. Up until the 1970s, when a lot of societal change was going on. You had the women's liberation movement. You had civil rights. You had gay rights. You had all these other things. You had a lot of social changes going on in the 70s. That scared the establishment. And that's why you had the backlash. I'm going to continue to read from the article. But also poor in time. And this is a very good point. That's my next dimension of poverty. Americans can't do much to change their society, not nearly enough, because they're time poor. They work harder than anyone else in the rich world by a very, very long way. Taking a vacation in America is something that mostly you'll get fired for. I disagree with that point, but I'll get to that in a moment. Commuting 3 hours a day, that's your problem. Americans have no time, and they don't quite understand yet that that's a deep form of poverty, because when you're always running out of time, when do you save, invest, educate, reflect, or just have a decent life? You don't. You're always weary, tired, panicked, on a hair trigger, and eventually you go numb. This isn't some sort of gigantic conspiracy here, folks. This is something that, in many cases, has been exploited by rich elites, and also is our own fault. We are very competitive here in the United States. We like to consider ourselves, we like to work hard and be the best and not take all that time off. Where, in reality, you can't work 40 hours a week and then go back home and work a lot back home around the house and do other things and be involved in your community and all this. Other nations have realized it's a problem, and they've gotten away from the 40-hour work week. And you have to remember, one time in our nation's history, the idea of a 40-hour work week was revolutionary. Because before that, people were working far more than that for less money. Henry Ford brought it up because he wanted people to enjoy the cars. He didn't do it out of a sense of charity. He did it because he wanted his workers to buy cars to drive around and to basically generate profits for him. And he wanted them well rested, to where, and it was found through studies that his company, Ford Motor Company, conducted, I should say, that it was more efficient to have 8-hour work days than 12-hour work days. Now, we've gotten away from that because there are plenty of companies who want to work people as much as possible and think that it's okay to work 12 hours a day all this time, where in reality, studies have shown that that's not necessarily so efficient. But I'll get back to that later. And this is a very good article. I don't agree with everything this writer says. I want to stress that importantly. I don't like the fact that he uses the American idiot as a term. It's very strong. It's very controversial. But there are times when you have to realize that you're not as smart as you think you are. Okay? I've had this revelation many times in my lifetime that I'm not as smart as I think I am. And sometimes you have to have somebody from outside of your sphere of influence to tell you what the story is really all about. How you look at how you look to other people, not just in your sphere of influence, your group of circle of friends, I should say, but also to your general community and whatnot. I'm continuing the article. This brings me to a next kind of poverty, emotional poverty. Americans live severely impoverished emotional lives. America consistently ranks as much unhappier country than Scandinavia, which is actually a region, not a country in itself. And falling. It's among the angriest place and most stressed out place in the world. I'm thinking this person, whoever wrote this, their English is not their native language. But I digress. Backing all that up, rates of depression have soared way past global norms. Suicides are skyrocketing, hopelessness and despair are endemic too. Imagine that you live a life of financial poverty, time poverty, and public health poverty like most Americans do. What kind of life is that emotionally? A poor one. It's full of nights where you can't sleep, wondering how to pay the bills. It's riddled with anxiety and panic. Uncontrollable thoughts race through your mind. Pretty soon you're like, well, most Americans, angry, stressed out, and depressed. No matter how hard you work, you never seem to able to make ends meet. You never have enough time to spend with your loved ones or just relaxing or learning something new. But those are the greatest sources of happiness of all. Is it any wonder Americans are miserable and furious mostly then? Well, there's a lot of truth to that. It's not that there's this giant, vast conspiracy of people trying to make Americans miserable. There are people who want to try and squeeze more blood out of the turnip of the American worker. It's been going on because we have this sense of this country that of rugged individualism, of not having to fend for, have people help us out or anything, and it's become a destructive sort of chaos because we don't have that sense of togetherness, of collective community, sense of community anymore. In olden times, you used to be friends with your neighbors. You used to work together as neighbors in neighborhoods and communities and whatnot, and now that's not so much anymore. And I think part of it is the fact that we have, through communication, through especially the internet, you can lead a completely different life online than you do on offline. It's theoretically possible. Not just theoretically possible, it's actually reality now because some people do. Now he starts his next paragraph, the American idiot made all that happen too, who votes again and again for no real mental health care. In America, you can get medicated, the lowest cost answer, or you can get therapy. But getting proper mental health care the way you can in Europe and Canada, careful, long-term psychotherapy. That doesn't exist at all in America, outside maybe a handful of major cities. The American idiot responded, instead, to life becoming a nightmare of dystopian distress, misery, and anger with something else, with rage, with hate, with cruelty and brutality that have made America a laughingstock the world over. Why does the American idiot deny everyone, including themselves, better income, health care, retirement, pension, more time to have a decent life? Because they've internalized the notion that nobody has any intrinsic worth, and therefore everybody must be a vicious competitor, fighting everyone else off for the morsels of basics, whether it's jobs, health care, pensions, and so on. Okay? But these are things that when people cooperate, as they do in Canada and Europe, they can simply give each other. Now here is the problem. This isn't a new thing. We can't just dump it off on people like Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump or anybody. This has been going on for a long time. Why? Because I read many years ago that in other countries, poor people see themselves as having dignity, hardworking, respectful, and all this. In America, poor people generally think of themselves as simply temporarily displaced millionaires. We look at shows back in the 80s like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and think that's the measure of success. It used to not be that way. America has worshipped wealth, thinking that is the epitome of success. It's corroded some religious thought, as in the prosperity gospel. It has infected other parts of society. And this is something that's important. You know, we have to remember that not everybody, that we're not, when you talk about America, it's not just one homogeneous population. We are very complicated people. Like I said earlier, there's immigrants from all over the world that have come here. Every single region of the world, every single nation of the world has sent a small community at the very least here. It's been that way. And I continue with the article. Never mind, the American idiot, led off a cliff by greater fools like Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump, believe that the only way out of an abusive society is to be a bigger, hungrier, more vicious predator. This is something you cannot just blame on Tucker and Donald Trump. They're just symptoms of a greater disease. Greed. That started in the 80s when we started fetishizing greed. Shows like Dallas and Dynasty made you think it's cool to be rich. Despite the fact that studies have shown it's not always necessarily a good thing mentally to be rich. It's nice to be financially secure and all that, but not necessarily always happy to be rich. But all that happens that way is that society implodes into a spectacular orgy of self-destruction and becomes an unlivable place because unbelievable cruelty to the rest of the world becomes a norm, like letting kids be shot at school and indifference to life, which culminates ultimately in the mass death of a virus. All that brings me to another kind of poverty, one that we don't yet have a good name for. A poverty of trust, of goodness, of decency. Americans are impoverished in this deep way, which I can put most simply and accurately by saying that they seem to genuinely hate each other. It's not nice living in a society of people who hate each other. A society of hateful people can't even cooperate to accomplish anything, whether beating a deadly pandemic or creating a better future by investing together in schools, hospitals, ideas, research, accomplishments. Now, I don't mean that you hate anyone. I mean in a more technical way, one that's almost invisible in America because, like air, it's just the atmosphere that surrounds everyone. What else, though, can it really be called when some large number of Americans deny over and over everyone else the right to have health care, an education, a job with decent standards, free time, a rising income, a democracy? You only do these things if you hate people. Yes, really hate them. I would never deny you health care, goes the sentiment in Europe and Canada, when even the hard right wing isn't against basic public goods. American idiots will deny their own kids and parents decent lives, though. The only accurate word to describe such a sentiment is hate, because when you deny someone the basics like Medicare, retirement, you're also hurting them badly in very real ways. They're going to suffer much worse lives, whether measured in longevity, happiness, income, or relationships, as a result of that denial. And here is a very key part of the article. The American idiot is an abuser. He abuses everyone he can, right down to his own loved ones, and think that's sanity, compassion, goodness. It's not. It's only a recipe for self-destruction, because a society of people, enough of them, hell-bent on abusing everyone else, right down to their loved ones, can only implode into ruin, bitterness, hardship, and suffering. I'm going to move off that article for a moment to get to its last part of poverty. There's a lot of truth to that. A lot of it, and this isn't anything new, folks. We can't just blame this all on Donald Trump or Fox News or anything. This has been going on longer than Fox News has been around, longer than Donald Trump ever thought about being president of the United States. Longer than even before Reagan became president. When you have a clash of cultures like we have in the United States, where you have sizable immigrant populations, and I'm not just talking about Hispanics, I'm not just talking about Asians, I'm not just talking about Arabs or Indians, as in from India, but from parts of Europe. You have Jewish cultures, you have Islamic people, you have Buddhists, you have Christians of various denominations and such that are interacting in communities every day, and it's not always been homogeneous. We have this myth of believing that the melting pot has completely worked, and there are people who want to narrow the definition of an American into this homogeneous sense of ideals, and this is a lot of it's on the right wing, but also on the left wing too. So, in my mind, we, instead of living together and embracing our differences and understanding our differences, and knowing everybody's not going to agree with every single thing we believe in, instead of trying to emphasize our similarities, we are told by culture, by government, by even to religious leaders and such, that the differences matter and the similarities don't. We can't compromise anymore. It's either my way or the highway. If I can't get my way, how dare you make me wear a mask when, even though scientific evidence says that it is helpful, extremely helpful in protecting yourself and your community and other people against this pandemic, we don't do it because we have been taught by culture that it's an infringement of our freedoms, without realizing that freedoms are not entirely, totally, 100% free. You don't have infinite freedom. There are boundaries. We give our children boundaries, do we not? We expect government to have boundaries. Should we not expect to have ourselves have boundaries? Other people have boundaries? I'm going to finish up with the article as much as I can. This brings me to my final form of poverty. If I deny you the basics, healthcare, education, and so on, what am I really doing? I am destroying your human potential, and that is America's truest and deepest form of poverty. Americans now live lives of sharply limited and circumscribed possibilities. Go nowhere, dead-end lives. You can see that too in basic statistics like the death of upwards mobility, the loss of hope in the future, the fact that young people can't afford to move out and start families, that half of all jobs are now low-wage service work. In America, your life is going to be much, much poorer than in any other rich country. Elsewhere, you could probably get an education, a much better one, and not be crippled by debt for life. There are more better jobs with better standards. There's more free time to have a family, to form bonds, to love. There are better social protections, which means you can spend less time anxious and stressed out. All of that doesn't just add up to less depression and suicide and more happiness. Happiness is a facet of an even greater thing, human potential. There you are, young person in America. What are your options? More industries have now imploded, from news to media to education. That's why half the jobs are now low-wage service work, which is a polite pundit's way of saying being a servant. You end up driving an Uber, delivering an Instacart, doing gig work, pursuing your side hustle when and where you can. What the hell? You're educated. You have a long collection of degrees and diplomas, and yet you never become the thing you could have, the one thing that would have benefited everyone, that scientist, researcher, novelist, journalist, profession, musician, who can. Nobody can make ends meet. Nobody has time for anything but to be exploited and abused in the name of trying to make ends meet. So what is there left over in time or money to invest in oneself? One dimension of human potential is what you make of yourself professionally, and you realize one day, terrified, that you will never amount to what you wanted to, but to be a glorified neo-servant for much of your life. But another is relational, what you can make of yourself socially. As an American now, you can't even afford to start a family, have a home, develop a lifelong relationship. That's how badly your human potential has been destroyed. That's how poor you are in human possibility. You will not just be that scientist, researcher, journalist, novelist. You also will not be that dad, mom, grandparent, husband, wife, or loved one. You'll work for a pittance and then you'll die. You'll make billionaires, trillionaires, and demagogue dictators all along the way. But you're expandable, disposable, nobody. That's thanks to the American idiot. He's a person so breathtakingly foolish to the rest of the world that he makes America a laughingstock. Precisely because he's believed nobody's life has any intrinsic value, beginning with his own, extending to his loved ones, all the way to you, to everyone. If he's happy to abuse himself, having internalized the lesson that he's been taught all his life, that only brutality matters and cruelty counts, why wouldn't he abuse everyone else too? America has become unlivable, so you can live there and you'll be okay, but you'll be poor. Poor in ways that are strange and hard to comprehend because they're both old and new. You'll be poor financially, of course, like someone living in a collapsing society, but that's just the beginning. You'll be poor in terms of public health, like someone from medieval times. You'll be poor in terms of time and power, like a peasant from pre-war times. You'll be poor emotionally, like someone living in a country with no hope. And you'll be poor socially, politically, and culturally, like in a country turning fascist authoritarian. All that adds up to a coup de grace. You'll be poor in terms of human potential. You'll never become what you're capable of being, not to the same degree as elsewhere. Don't get me wrong, humanity has lived through a lot. Plagues, wars, collapses, implosions. Life doesn't come to an end, it goes on. But you know what the point of all these things were? Not to repeat them. That is the most minimal definition of what progress is, and so far, America has yet to meet even that. Maybe then that's what is the truest kind of poverty is too. And that's the end of the article. Okay. Like I said, I don't agree with everything that the mayor said in this article. I don't know if he's from the United States. I don't know if he's living here. I don't know if he's been here and lived in Europe or whatever. So I don't agree with everything he writes about here. And like I said, the term American idiot is a very strong term indeed. But there is a lot of truth to this. And once you get past the shock of seeing the words American idiot, like I did, when I first saw this, I thought, oh, here we go, another America basher. No, it's one of those things that comes about when you have a good friend who sees you on a bad path, has to shake you out of your reality, has to say, look, this is a bad thing you're doing to your life, to your country, to the world. We have fetishized greed in this country. We have fetishized the fact that everyone for themselves. Don't trust anybody. You're on your own. To the point where it's almost like the Hunger Games. May the odds be ever in your favor. Instead of working together to help build a society that's better for everyone, we are sliced and diced into separate communities. It's not just white supremacy that's the problem here, ladies and gentlemen. This is not that's something that's always been out there, mainly because it's meant to divide people. It's not about the poor whites are not the supreme people, it's the rich whites. They're the ones who want to be supreme. The establishment, the former plantation owners. People like that. People who have had money their entire lives. Or who worked generations before, worked very hard, and their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or whatnot worked hard to get it. And let me stress, like I said, I don't agree with everything this guy put in this article. And there is something to be said about individualism and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and working hard for your goals and such. But if we don't see the collective as well as the individual, if we don't have that balance, then where are we as a society? When America was at her greatest in the late 40s, after we won the World War, in the 50s and 60s when we were sending men into space and making things better. Yeah, we had problems. We had civil rights problems. We were on the cusp of really discussing and maybe finishing up with this idea that maybe, just maybe, whites and blacks can live together equally and peacefully. And people didn't want that. Why? Because it threatened power structures. It threatened the establishment, the status quo. There are a lot of people right now who wave Confederate flags, who think that they are, who rally around Trump and all, thinking that Trump cares about them. Truth of the matter is, Trump doesn't care about them. And the people that really are supporting him, the ones that give him the money, aren't really caring about Trump. He's a tool. Presidents aren't the leaders they once were. They have people around them that influence them. They're in a bubble. And more than anything else, they're more figureheads than anything else. It's the people around the president that are the problem. Take, for example, George W. Bush. His biggest influences are Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, among others. That's why we went to war with Iraq, because they wanted to. Not necessarily George W. Bush, but because Saddam Hussein had threatened George W. Bush's father. Cheney and Rumsfeld and others like him that wanted a war with Iraq. That 9/11 was a convenience, a way to get into that, to George W. Bush's mind that we had to go after Iraq, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were enemies. So, what I'm saying here is, No, there is no such thing as American idiot. You're not an idiot, I'm not an idiot, and all this. But we've become short-sighted. We are restraining ourselves by realizing that, we could be so much more. But because we have become a slave to this desire to be rich, desire to have more, and all this, consumerism and all this, it's one of those, I don't have all the answers to this. I saw this article and I was like, I had to do a podcast on this because, we have become a poor country. Maybe not in the wealth. I mean, yes, Wall Street, it says we're still very rich. But I look around my local community. We haven't recovered in the 20-some-odd years since the collapse of the textile industry. We haven't. For someone who's lived here for 49 years in this community of Rutherford County, North Carolina, it is not now what it once was in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And because of short-sightedness and greed and self-interest by certain people in the community who had wealth, they've handicapped us. Projects that should have been done decades ago are being done now in an effort to try and revive a dying county. And that's what Rutherford County is. I'm sorry, it is. And it's a part of a greater problem. Individual greed at the expense of national prosperity for everyone. That's it. The few get rich, the masses stay poor. If it were the opposite, where the few gave more to the government and to society in general, to invest in society instead of just putting it in an account somewhere and watching it gain money, they could gain much more money. They are handicapping themselves. So yeah, there is a concern that we're collapsing as a society, collapsing as a nation. It has nothing to do with faith. The problem is faith has been eroded by people who want to use faith. And this has been throughout history, way before America came along, where rich elites used religion for their own purposes. This isn't anything new, folks. We've been down this road before. Now, how do we solve this? I wish I had an answer. And the reason I'm coming to you with saying this today is that, and of course, that thing cut off at 30 minutes. Oh, well, I'll have to remember that next time. Here's the thing, and I'll let you go with this. We have the greatest nation in the world, and we're not running it the way we should. We could balance out individual prosperity, individual rights, and all this by also allowing for more collective rights, more social programs to help people without them becoming dependent upon them. We look at the social net as being this deep chasm where nobody can get out of, where it should be a trampoline where people have a difficult time, they bounce back up. We need to learn from other countries. We need to get some humility in our country to realize we don't have all the answers. That we aren't the smartest in the world. We're not the greatest in the world anymore. It's like when Jeff Daniels' character in the newsroom had the first episode had a great monologue. And it was a great monologue. I highly recommend it. You watch it, you'll find it online. Where he basically says America isn't the greatest country in the world. But we can be. We have to learn from other people. We have to be willing to build trust in one another. To rebuild trust in institutions that we once had that we were told that weren't working in our best interest. We've been told government is bad. Doesn't necessarily mean all government is bad. Doesn't mean we can't hold government accountable for their actions. Doesn't mean we can't have mechanisms in place to hold that government accountable for their actions. That's why you have people going around thinking cops are bad. Because we don't have mechanisms in place to, when there is a bad cop there, that they are punished for their actions. There is the perception that they're not. In some cases, that perception is reality. It's about equality. We've never been truly equal in this country. Never, not really. And that's what frightens the status quo, is true equality. The ability to have everybody have an equal opportunity to advance out of their current state. You can, yeah, in theory it's possible. And there have been plenty of success stories. But it's not for everybody anymore. And some of those success stories have parts of them that aren't as beautiful as you'd like. We have a habit of glorifying things we shouldn't really be glorifying in this country. Greed is one of them. Financial success is one thing. Being financially well off is one thing. Being greedy is another. There are people in this country who have more money than they'll ever know what to spend with. And yet they always want more. And not just in money, but in power and in influence. And there's where the real greed is, ladies and gentlemen. And we've surrendered that to them. Because we've been told, and we have bought into this idea that we can't let the other person, we have to look at the other person. They're the evil ones. They're the ones out to get you. And this is nothing new. This has happened many times in American history. Not just in American history, but all across the world. Throughout history. There's a reason they've dumbed down education. There's a reason why they want to privatize education. It's because they want to make money off of it, but also to influence the agenda. They talk about the left having an agenda. What about the right agenda? What about the right-wing agenda? What about the libertarian agenda? And this isn't, like I said, this isn't bashing Trump anymore. This has been going on way before Trump. And I'm not saying the right-wingers are, anywhere too. America's become polarized because we've been told we had to become polarized. The media is a part of the problem, not just the left wing, but the right wing as well. And there's a laundry list of things I can tell you why that happened. But a lot of it is very simple. Greed. Power, greed corrupts our society throughout. We have instilled in this culture the sense that we have to be powerful, we have to be greedy, we have to be selfish, we have to be competitive against everybody. We have to be the best at everything. And that can be helpful. That can be good in some cases, but not always. And in some cases right now we've seen it be like a cancer. So this article, well, I have a lot of disagreements with it, especially calling it the American idiot. I think that's very strong terms indeed, but the truth of the matter is it makes you reflect upon the country and the difficulties we have, and that we're not perfect. And we should accept that. We are not perfect. We're not the best in the world anymore. But we can be. We're never going to be perfect. But in our preamble, we have the more perfect union, and as part of the preamble of our Constitution. That's what we should strive for. We should have a society where individual achievement is rewarded, but also trying to build up our communities, trying to build up our nation as a whole, trying to build up each other as a whole. You can be rich as all get out and still be able to help your fellow human being. You help your fellow society, people, members of society. Help this country be better. We've lost that sense of the collective in this country because we've been told it's evil, socialism, and all this. But it works in Scandinavia, it works in Denmark, Finland, Scotland, or Sweden, Norway, Iceland, works in Germany, works in France. Not perfectly. They have their issues. They've got their own social problems they've got. It's the fact that there is an elite in this country that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s saw their power structures being challenged in the 70s. And they reacted. And for 40 years, they have been trying to entrench themselves to where you, the lowly individual, can't challenge them. But you can. It's all about education. It's all about realizing what's been going on. That's why we devalue history in this country. Or we fetishize it. We look at the Civil War and we don't see that it was about slavery. But more than that, it was about making sure we kept rich on top, poor on the bottom. It was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. A lot of the people who fought, who waved the Confederate flag, don't realize the veterans they think they're honoring may very well not have wanted to fight that war. That they themselves may have supported the Union. But because they lived in a foreign country now, they had to serve. They were required to serve. That's the sad part about it. They don't understand the complexities of history. We've romanticized that war. And part of it is dividing South from North. We have East versus West. So instead of being a United States working toward common goals, we've become rife with division. And that is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. The problem that is rife. It's not about being an American idiot. It's being about an American naivete. A naive American. Where you're taught by an educational system constantly underfunded, constantly at war by people who wants to constantly criticize it because they want to subsume it and turn it into something that's basically making out worker bees. That's what they want you to be, worker bees. They don't want you to be human beings. They want you to be worker bees. Replaceable cogs in the machine. That's what they want you to be. And not getting out of your lane, so to speak. American society has to change for the better. It can. It means that we have to sometimes throw off some of our... You have to reform a lot of things in society. You have to address a lot of hard questions that are going to take a long time to solve. But we can. So you can take this article and think it's just bashing America. Or you can take it like I took it and go, you know what? Maybe we aren't as great as we think we are. Maybe we have become our worst enemy. And that we need to take a cold, hard look at ourselves in the mirror and go, what can we do to change ourselves to make ourselves better? That's what we need to do, folks. All you take away from this article is that, oh, it's about America bashing and all this. No. It's about someone who cares about America, who's probably one time in their life looked at America as being the shining beacon of hope and freedom in the world and sees it now as anything but that. Sometimes the best thing you can do is find out what other people think of you. Sometimes you realize those people are full of it. Sometimes you realize you're full of it yourself. That's important to remember. We're not the greatest country in the world anymore. We can be. It's potential. We have to realize. We sent people to the moon. We can send people to Mars. We can do all sorts of things. We have to find a way to do it together while still keeping a sense of individualism as well. That's the great balancing act that we've gone away from. We can get it again. I hope you managed to find a way to listen all the way through this. But I hope that you got a little bit of what I got out of this. Alright, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this. Maybe I pissed you off, maybe I didn't. But I hope you learned something from this. And sometimes you can read an article that you may think it's just another attack, but in reality it's somebody saying, hey, we like you, but you got to change your ways because you're headed down a bad road. And I think that's what this article is all about. Making us think maybe we are the idiots after all. We just don't want to accept that. Maybe we are. And maybe we need to take a moment to look at ourselves in the mirror and realize that we need to change things. That the right isn't on the right politically. That the left isn't right. Maybe we need to meet in the middle and come to some compromises of what makes America better. Not just for a certain group of people, for everyone. That's what we need to do. And that's it for now. Good night, good luck, may the good news be yours.